Hi, everybody. Thanks ever so much for logging into the session. My name's David Green. I'm Professor of Historical Geography at King's. I've been there over 40 years, so I've seen some changes, but probably none as dramatic as this year. So it's a challenge, but actually it's been an interesting one. I actually run a research project which is a large research project with up to 8 people. And we are now very effectively switching to online, and we can do that with the resources that we've got for around about 6 to 9 months, we reckon. And all of that is because there are so many sources available. And that's partly what I'm going to be going through today. I'm not going to go through what you know better than I do, which is the fieldwork requirements in the A-level syllabus, also drawing on the AQA. But it was interesting to have a look at them and to think about the questions that you raised before joining the session. And I just want to go to those questions. This is a word cloud that Mark produced from the answers that you gave to what are the key challenges that students have in conducting fieldwork investigations. And one of the things that struck me was that one of the key problems is the questions. You know, what questions can you ask, and what data can you use to answer those, particularly in the current situation where fieldwork may be difficult to do in a physical sense. Well, as a historical geographer, I'm very used to actually doing hands-on research in a very virtual sense, in that most of the archives that I use, and in an increasing number, are now available online. And I'm going to go through some of those, but based around questions. So thinking about fieldwork, Kevin is quite right. The first thing is to ask the right questions. But I think it's also to think about the processes that might help you answer the questions. And then how can we do that in a virtual environment using freely available online resources that one of your students can access themselves? I'm going to ask 3 kind of questions. First is about economic change in the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to be looking at the energy sources there. How can we begin to explore changes in energy use during the Industrial Revolution? I'm then going to look at a rural example, which is what's happened to farm sizes in England and Wales, and how does that impact on biodiversity? And again, we're going to be doing all that virtually. And then I'm going to be coming down to London and looking at urban redevelopment and gentrification. How can we begin to explore that, and who gains and who loses? All of those topics, and you'll see that there's a kind of chronology there. It's economic, industrial, urban, and rural. So there's different variety there. All of those are potential research topics you can do, your students can do, with easily available free material online. But the key thing is to ask the right questions. And the materials we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail are Digimap, which schools have access to, Google Earth Pro, which is free to download, and some mapping capacity from the National Library of Scotland then and now. The links are given in the presentation, and there's an additional set of resources at the end of this slideshow. So when a student comes to me and says, you know, I'm interested in this, I just say, well, some of the questions that you want to ask are very straightforward. You know, what is it? Where is it? When does it take place? How do we know does it take place or something happens? And why? And the why questions are often linked to those different processes, the social, economic, political, technological, and environmental. So what changes have taken place? Where have they taken place? When did they take place? As a historical geographer, I'm particularly interested in that. How do we know that they've actually taken place? So you have to measure change over time. So you need some sort of time series. And why did they take place? That's the explanatory side of it. So I start from a very basic set of questions, and at that stage you start to look for the data. So here are 3 examples, just thinking about some questions. The first one is to do with the Industrial Revolution, and it's mapping industrial change over time. It's a classic Industrial Revolution. This actually comes from a slide published in a book by Edward Baines, published in 1835. It's freely available. It's actually, this version is from the Wellcome Library, which in itself is a massive library and has a large amount of resources online. I'll refer to one of those later on. Where do they get the power for this kind of machinery? Was it always, you know, what was it? Where did it come from? And to do that, we need to think about the different forms of power. We often dismiss the Industrial Revolution as a kind of steam-powered, factory-driven phenomenon, but actually the earliest machines were driven not by steam, but by water. So is there a historical geography of water? Why do water-powered mills locate where they are? And what are the implications of that? Why do some switch to coal or continue with water? So what is it about the technology or the geography or economic inertia that kind of impacts the kind of energy use that industry has? And what are the environmental factors that might influence the use of water, particularly drought and frost? What other human factors might impact on water, competing uses, for example? How would an entrepreneur respond to disruption of water supplies? It's an economic geography question. And what might encourage the switch from one form of energy to another? And finally, I just want to raise a question. How important is water today? Is water power today? So there's a series of questions. I think any one of these could form a really good dissertation topic. We can't answer all of them, but we're going to give a try to see how we might go about looking at that in a virtual way. And to do that, I'm going to focus on the first factory, or one of the first factories of the Industrial Revolution, which was Sir Richard Arkwright's cotton mill at Cromford in Derbyshire, which is shown here on the bottom left during the day, and is shown also at night on the right-hand side. It's a very famous painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, and the fact it was painted at night shows that it was working continuously. So this was a very important change, not just in the way we produce things, but also in the way people lived their lives. And Cromford is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site in its own right. This is Digimap. It's available to schools. It has a historic roam function, which means that you can go back in time and look at maps and overlay maps to show change. And we're going to be using this to look at what happens when factories using water power begin to experience problems. Digimap has a really useful and very basic GIS function, which is shown on the left-hand side. It doesn't take long to get to grips with. You don't need any expensive software. It's there for you to use. So here I've just plotted the various mill ponds and mills that were upstream from Richard Arkwright's Cromford Mill. And you can see immediately that he's got a problem, because having set up a mill based on water power and drawing on the stream that the blue dots, the mill ponds, trace, anybody that sets up a mill upstream from him begins to dam his water. How does he respond? Should he purchase those mills? Should he build leats to bypass those competitors? Should he relocate his mill? Should he switch to coal? Or in the 20th century, should he switch? Should that mill switch to electricity? So these are important questions, and you can begin to unravel the answers to those by beginning to analyze this kind of map data. Let's see what happens. Here is one of those mill ponds on the left-hand side on an original map going back to the 1880s. On the right-hand side is a relatively recent photograph from Google Earth. And you can see that that mill pond no longer exists. It's shown in a red oval shape on the screen. What's happened to that mill pond? And why did it disappear? And when did it disappear? There it is, a slightly more close up, so you can see that actually it's now covered over by trees. Well, we can follow this process through by looking at maps from different dates. Digimap Historic Rome gives you the opportunity for some areas to go back to the 1840s, but in most cases, the 1880s might be the earliest you can go back, but that's still well over 100 years. So it gives a very long time span to look at geographical change. This is the mill pond in the 1880s. So it's still there, it's still functioning, and it extends all the way up here, as you can see. Let's just move on. Those, I'm just showing you on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm highlighting the GIS, fairly simple, straightforward GIS tools allow you to map and create layers based on the different maps themselves. And just showing you the date line there. This is the mill pond in the 1880s, shown in purple. We know it's still functioning. Let's move forward from the 1880s, which is still over 150 years after Cromford's Mill was first opened. Sorry, 100 years from the opening of Cromford's Mill, it's still dependent on water power, actually. In the 1920s, that mill pond had was beginning to shrink. It's one of its main sources of water to the mill, and it's shrinking. By the 1960s, that mill pond has actually shrunk to a virtual puddle located around here. The rest has now, on the map, been filled in with a kind of marsh symbol, marsh-like symbol for vegetation here. So this is probably no longer an operating mill pond. It just doesn't have enough power. By the 1960s, you would expect industrial activity to be powered perhaps by electricity rather than by water. So we've got a sense of deindustrialization in Cromford, just looking at a series of maps, plotting them and layering over where the mill pond was. And we can do that. That was just one mill pond. You can do that for the whole of that sequence of mill ponds that I showed you. And you would see the gradual shift away from water power for those mills. Just to bring it up to the present, if a student was interested in, wanted to say, well, what's the role of water power today? There are plenty of ways of looking at that online. This is just one of those sources. This is a map of UK renewable energies. It not only maps hydropower, small and large, it also maps wind and other forms of sustainable energy. So you could ask students to think about why are those located where they are. And as you'll see, in terms of hydropower, most are up in the north of Scotland, and needless to say, Scottish Highlands are very interested in those kind of alternative sources of energy that are local, small scale, sustainable. And this is a map of those hydro schemes on the left-hand side. But if you wanted to look at wind power, there's also opportunity to do that. So linking the past to the present through the creative use of maps and asking a series of questions about whether power is still being used to generate, water is still being used to generate power, might be something that you can do virtually from a computer screen rather than a physical visit. That's the Industrial Revolution, economic change using simple mapping. Let's switch and look at rural. One of the issues that the countryside faces is loss of species diversity. And one of the reasons for that is because of the removal of hedgerows. So the question is why has that occurred? When did it occur? And how can we begin to even map it in a virtual sense if we can't go out to the countryside anymore and take a look? So I started by just saying, where is the greatest loss of hedgerows in the country? In a Google search, it came up with Norfolk. I just had a quick look on Google Earth, picked a small village, in this case Fincham, population 500. It's you can see where it's located. It's just south of King's Lynn on the top left. And the questions I wanted to I was interested in is, when did the loss of hedgerows take place? What might have been the processes leading to that? And thinking in slightly different ways, what might be the biodiversity implications of loss of hedgerows? If you wanted to quantify loss of hedgerows, it would be possible to do that using these kind of resources. So we'll take a look now. So again, using Edina, using historic Rome, I started with what does the area look like today? There's on the bottom right now, you'll see that map. Interestingly enough, if you look closely at that map, you'll also see some lighter and darker areas. Those lighter and darker areas actually pick out old field boundaries. In 1980, next to it, the field was more or less in its current shape. But 100 years prior to that, in the top left-hand side, you'll see that actually that large field was made up of several much smaller fields. That was also true of 1920, so we're following this through over time. And it was also true of 1950, but sometime between 1950 and 1980, things changed. So the question is, what changed? Why did it change? What factors drove the amalgamation of larger fields? It wasn't the only field that was amalgamated. It's one of the largest ones just north of Fincham. Was it technological? Perhaps the introduction of new kinds of machinery? Was it political? Did it have something to do with the EU agricultural subsidies? Did it have something to do with changing agricultural practices and crop growth? I don't know the answer to that, but that's to find out in a dissertation. If we wanted to, you could actually use the GIS function in Edina to map the number of hedgerows based on the field boundaries. But we're not going to do that today, but it's something that a student might possibly do. And finally, my last example is close to home, this time in London. It's actually quite close to where I live in London, which is in Bermondsey. And we're going to be using something which National Library of Scotland produced, which is a comparison on the same screen of an old version of an OS map and a current version. Just Google National Library of Scotland, then and now. I think it's called Side by Side. This is what it looks like. This is the Surrey Quays area in London. It's just south of Canary Wharf. Canary Wharf is on the north side of the Thames. Surrey Quays is on the south. It's actually about to undergo another bout of redevelopment, or it was. I'm not sure whether that's still going ahead. But on the left-hand side is what it looked like in the 1880s and early 1900s. It's a very important dock area. And on the right-hand side is what it looks like today, an aerial view. But these comparisons, and you can switch them around, these comparisons are very useful for thinking about geographical change. So the question I've got is, what what does this change look like? How's it related to gentrification? What are the processes that might have encouraged that? This is just another an aerial view from Google Earth Pro. If you can't visit the area, why not use Google Street View and take a look at the street level view of the houses, or Google Earth Pro and look at their 3D capability. So this makes the place much more real than a flat 2D map. If you can't visit it, this is the next best thing. Get Google to visit it for you. Now, somebody asked a question in the teachers, the pre-event questions. What about quantification? So how might we start with the image, but then actually try and do a bit more quantitative work on it? Where can we get that information? So one of the questions I would have is, what are the key characteristics of gentrification? How might we measure it and compare whether an area is gentrified or compared to somewhere else? And for here, we can start to begin to link those mapping data to local area data from the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, and their NOMIS website, which is the 2011 census data, which is shown here on the left-hand side for the Surrey Keys area. And you can pick out the socioeconomic composition by perhaps looking at the occupational distribution or the degree, the level of education of populations, right down to ward level. So quite local areas, an area that you might reasonably expect a school student to be aware of and know quite well. Might be if it's their home area. So the question that you might have is, how gentrified is a gentrified area? At what point does it become gentrified? Is it a continuum? Are there distinct breaks? And how could we measure those breaks? And finally, in terms of gentrification, you need to really ask perhaps some slightly searching critical questions. Who benefits, who gains, who loses? What processes drive gentrification? And don't forget, questions are the key thing to research. The data comes second. What are your research questions? So any of these questions, what is gentrification? Where does it occur? What processes drive it? And who gains and who loses? We can begin to unpick from the quantitative data, from the mapping data, and from Google searches. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Well, I hope I've given you 3 examples where virtual fieldwork can be carried out online using freely available sources and very simple techniques to begin to answer some really quite searching questions. We could have done this with any number of different online sources. We could have looked at medical officers of health reports. For example, where did the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic impact on London most? And I've got a dissertation student that's looking at that through these medical officer of health reports, which are all available free from the Wellcome Library. I've also had students look at murder in London in the 19th century, and they used the Old Bailey online and took a sample. These are all trials at the Old Bailey. And one of the things they found was really interesting was that guilty verdicts tended to be clustered in the built-up area, and not guilty verdicts were more common in the suburban areas. And the reason they concluded, which was really interesting, I thought, was there were fewer witnesses in the suburbs than there were in the more crowded, densely populated parts of town. All of that work was done entirely online using the Old Bailey sources. Or we might want to look at poverty and wealth in 19th century London and compare it to today. We can do that by looking at Charles Booth's poverty maps, which are all online, linked to the notebooks that describe the areas. And there's a great new site which is called Layers of London, which has got fantastic resources for teaching. And finally, my last slide is we might also want to ask some more contemporary stories that do exactly the same. London Data Store has fantastic sources available online at local level for housing, employment, all sorts of activities in London. That's published by the Mayor's Office. Or the National Office of National Statistics, which I've already mentioned, has got extremely good resources, again, freely available on local areas down to ward level. And of course, we're in an unusual situation in relation to health. If you wanted to begin to look at different health geographies, Public Health England's website called Fingertips is extremely good and also freely available. So thank you very much for listening. I'm very pleased to answer any questions you've got. I think the key message I'd like to give you is there's lots of opportunities to do virtual field work and answer some really interesting searching questions. So thanks very much for listening.